Hello, everyone. This week, we will be talking about cultural competence in research. So, your reading for this week is chapter 6 of the textbook. And according to Rubin and Babby, cultural competence means being aware of and appropriately responding to the ways in which cultural factors and cultural differences influence what we investigate, how we investigate, and how we interpret our findings. So in this week, we're essentially trying to define what culturally competent research is, and then think about some of the research strategies that we can employ during problem formulation, recruitment, retention, measurement, and analysis so that our research is more culturally competent. And then I also wanted to talk about community-based participatory research, which is a form of doing culturally competent research. So, what is culturally competent research? So, so there are different elements to how you make a research study more culturally competent than not, right? So, for instance, how are you choosing what you're planning to study? How are you collecting your data? And then how are you interpreting your research findings? So, for instance, in terms of what you are choosing for your research study, is that something that is of interest to the population that you are studying? Are your research questions being informed by what the community thinks is important? In terms of how we conduct the research, are the measurement tools as well as the sampling adequate? That is, for instance, the studies that do not have adequate representation from minority populations in their samples are not generalizable. So, being aware of who comprises the sample and what kind of generalizations are researchers drawing about the general population is important. So, when you are conducting a study, are you making sure that all your demographic groups, your various demographic groups, are being represented? The minority populations are being adequately represented in the study. And if not, if they're not being represented, make sure that the study is not trying to generalize to these populations that have not been represented during the sampling process. So, that's where how we conduct research and how we interpret research findings sort of inform each other. So make sure, in terms of how we conduct the research study, make sure that the populations, the various elements of the population, the various demographic groups within the population are adequately represented. And then when you are interpreting the research findings, make sure that the study is generalizable to all the different demographic groups within the population. And if there isn't representation, then the study should not try to generalize to populations that have not been represented in the sample, right? So I hope that that makes sense. I sort of went back and forth a little bit on that. Um, so, researchers who are culturally competent should be able to provide information that is relevant, that is useful, and that is valid for various minority and oppressed populations. So, in order to ensure cultural competence in research studies, there are various steps that we should take when in trying to formulate research that is more socially just. And these steps should be taken at each stage of the research process. So, for instance, when we are trying to formulate a research problem or we're trying to formulate a research question, one thing that is important is to steer clear of ethnocentrism. In the case of ethnocentrism is essentially believing that one's own culture or one's own ethnic beliefs are superior to those of the others. So make sure that there aren't elements of cultural judgment when you are formulating a research question. So just because something is different doesn't make it necessarily worse. And that this should be pretty obvious to all of you as social workers. But it is something that is important to look for in research studies and make sure that the researchers are formulating the problem and formulating the research questions in a way that is not ethnocentric. One way to really try and ensure cultural competence during the problem formulation phase is to actually seek guidance from members of the impacted population or the impacted communities. So don't just rely on one person to represent or be the voice for that entire community or the entire population, or just be a part of the study and then you're like, oh, this is, see, the community is represented, right? You're not looking for token representation. You are asking various members of the impacted population to understand why this is a problem for them, how they define a particular problem, and whether it is important for them to understand the answers. And this is something that is, again, something that you should be looking for when you are looking through research, that how did the researchers formulate the research problem? How did they formulate the research questions? And was there any involvement of the community or of the impacted populations in the problem formulation phase? So once a more culturally competent research problem has been formulated, the researcher is going to move on to the research design phase. And there are certain things to keep in mind during the recruitment and the retention phases of the study design. So, for instance, one important, interesting step would be, or one valuable step would be to hire local community members to work on the study and to ensure that all staff members are culturally competent. So, instead of bringing in outsiders into the study, how can you train or use members who are part of the community to, say, collect the data, or to, say, reach out to community members and recruit them for the study? So how do you involve local community members? And so one of the studies that I did, that I was a part of, was a community-based research project that looked at Alzheimer's help seeking among Korean Americans about Alzheimer's disease. So what were their awareness levels, and what were some of their help seeking practices? So one thing that we did before the data collection process started was involving the local community centers that worked with this population in order to understand how they would formulate the problems, how they would recommend that we go about the research project. So the local community centers were involved right at the beginning of the research project when the problem was still being formulated. Then a member of the community who obviously spoke the language, who was a local member who was active in that community, went to churches, went to events of the community, and was a visible member of the community, was then hired to collect the data for the research project. So this community member was hired to be the program coordinator or the research coordinator, and then go out and collect surveys or collect and administer the surveys and collect data about the surveys, right? So that was another way in which the recruitment process was facilitated by community participation. Again, obviously, the staff that we hired for the data collection as well as the analysis part was bilingual. And then and make sure that you're giving adequate compensation to the study participants, and that is also another way to improve retention rates. And then, of course, mitigate issues. So try and think about what possible issues or challenges or obstacles there might be in the research process, and try and anticipate those and then try to mitigate them. So, for instance, if you are working with a community or working in a community where there are transportation issues, where there are childcare issues, then that may interfere with the participation of the staff. Figure out that is there childcare that you will be able to provide at the center that you're collecting data from? Is there transportation that you can provide to your participants so they can go back and forth from the clinic, bring their children if necessary, and then have somebody to provide childcare during the intervention, right? So these are some of the ways in which you're trying to ensure cultural competence in both the recruitment phase as well as the retention phase, right? So making sure that not trying to formulate ways where you can retain the minority populations or the disadvantaged populations in the study, and that you do not see a disproportionate drop in the number of people who belong to a particular population as the research study progresses. In terms of measurement and analysis, again, if you are interviewing, or in our case, we administer the surveys, use interviewers or people who are administering the surveys who speak the same language, are the same ethnicity, and are trained in cultural competence, right? So make sure if it is a bilingual study, make sure that there is translation validity, which is strong, and measurement equivalence has been assessed. So this all the measures or the tools that are being used have been translated into the language that they'll be administered in, and then translated back to make sure that there is translation validity. Pre-testing and background research, some pilot testing may help in identifying and then eliminating cultural biases. And then, of course, avoid interpreting ethnic differences in a prejudicial manner, and ensure that you do not focus on the deficits or focus too much on the deficits or focus too little on the strengths. So try and remember the context of the cultural group, and then and when you're interpreting the data, and then as you're analyzing the data, as you're interpreting the data, try and place it in the appropriate cultural context, so that you are not coming to wrong conclusions about the data. So one thing that is important to think about is the process of acculturation, and take the level of acculturation of the population into account. So for instance, if you are looking at a group of Asian Americans, then there might be varying levels of acculturation. So for example, if they are youth, or they are people who are first generation as opposed to people who are second generation, and even within those subgroups there might be varying levels of acculturation, and that is something that you should think through and take into account when formulating your research questions, as well as when collecting and interpreting the data. So you may want to have some questions that sort of look at their level of acculturation, for instance, and then try and account for that if it's a quantitative study. In a qualitative study, you would have, again, staff that is bilingual and are collecting or multilingual and collecting data, and being able to sort of react to understand what the acculturation level of the participants are, and then be able to adjust and modify that. And that is why it is important for your research staff to have cultural competence training. So community-based participatory research is a form of research that is used very commonly in the public health field, but it also has a very important implications for the social work field. Um, I have linked a video in the video description, in the under the course contents. So make sure you watch the video of an example of a community-based participatory research project. This project that the video is from is a project on public health or community health in Nicaragua. But as you are trying to understand what community-based participatory research is, think about some examples of how you could use CBPR in your field setting. And that would be the focus of your discussion board group activity for this week. So think about the ways in which research can be made more culturally competent. Think about when you are analyzing your articles, or when you're looking at studies, research studies, look and see how whether the researchers have really addressed the issue of cultural competence, especially if it is social justice oriented research, or the researchers are claiming that a particular intervention is going to work for the population in general. So try and always assess any research study for its cultural competence. And then in the future, if you're ever part of a research study or you are involved in research projects in some way, try and figure out how to make it more culturally competent. Thank you for listening to this class lecture. Hope you guys have a great week ahead. Thank you.